Oh, hello, and welcome to Dark Passages. Dark Passages is a weekly podcast presented by me, Chris Stone, reading stories I've written over the past 15 years or so. Today we will conclude The Afflicted with episode 3. Mr. Harrison, it's good to see you again. He mercilessly pulled his eyes away from the shell of Miss Adrian Carlson. Dr. Albright had finally made his way to the couch with his tight, toothy smile and too tan skin. He smelled like antiseptic and success. He accepted the doctor's hand and shook it slowly, carefully, through his dreamy, sedated reality. He tried to talk, but his mouth wasn't quite ready to cooperate yet. He felt like he'd been gargling Novocaine. "It's okay, Mr. Harrison. Don't talk yet." Dr. Albright checked his watch. "It's been only 40 minutes since your procedure. It takes some time for the clear to wear off, as I'm sure you'll remember." He sighed and flipped through the pages on his clipboard like doctors do, too fast to read any details, but just slow enough to make you think that they were. "Well, while you're recovering, I can tell you that once again this was a major league success. You should start to notice a difference in about an hour, after the clear has worked its way completely out of your system and the true begins to take hold." He wanted to tell him that the true was already working. His peanut butter brain had packed its bags and was on a train to any fucking where else. But he couldn't. His tongue was still betraying him, so instead he nodded. Sometimes it took longer than others. This time it appeared he was in for a far shorter recovery. And that was good. He didn't know how much longer he could sit in that room with all of those gray-skinned donors. The true was why he was there. It was the marketing name that the vampires had given their new wonder drug. He may have been able to calculate a stock's performance and been keen on when to get out and take a profit before losing your shirt and pants. But he didn't know fuck all about how medicine worked, and he didn't pretend to. But what he did know was that the true was a goddamn miracle. Dr. Albright eyed his wristwatch again. "I'm sure I don't have to remind you that the true will only stay in your system for about 90 days. Then you'll have to come back for another treatment. Veronica will be sure to set you up an appointment at the front desk when you're ready to go. But per my watch, you've got at least 30 more minutes of recovery time ahead of you, so just lean back and relax, my friend." He flashed his white toothy smile and was on his way, off to check other afflicted. The afflicted was the euphemism that they used to describe the clinic's patients, other old fucks whose brains were failing them as well. So he was left alone to recuperate on the couch. He could feel the clear starting to wear off and the true beginning to take its hold. The clear was like a warm-up act, slowly cleaning and scrubbing his brain with its memory-clearing powers. But the true was what he was paying for. The true brought a euphoric high. It brought life. It made him feel like himself again. His head buzzed with it, his veins pulsed with it. His brain lit up and every goddamn synapse seemed to fire at once. His brain begged to solve complex algebraic equations, to find a cure for cancer, to better mankind, to do something, anything. With this renewed clarity came all of his memories. He clearly remembered how he'd found the clinic. It wasn't exactly one of those places that advertised on TV. No. The clinic, a refurbished, previously abandoned warehouse, was stashed away in the shittiest area of the shittiest neighborhood in town. It was a place where cops won't even go. But there, right there in the middle of all that shit, all of those abandoned buildings, all those decaying, rotten lots, was this warehouse that no one would touch. This building that no kid would dare vandalize. No, this building was known by the locals through rumors alone, and they feared it. Those same youths that would firebomb a cop car without a second thought just for drifting into those long-lost streets, they were scared shitless of this building. The clinic didn't publicly advertise per se. In fact, Keith had just found a flyer neatly tucked inside a screen door some 30 miles away. This was how they found their clients. They sought them out, not the other way around. They meticulously searched for the wealthy, the rotting, the decaying. He figured they probably had an inside man at every major metropolitan hospital, a tipster who was more than willing to assuage with all of the HIPAA rules. He assumed this because the flyer that had appeared on his door a mere 2 days ago after Dr. Robinson, the family practitioner whom he'd grown old with, had diagnosed him with a rapidly aggressive form of dementia. It It seemed an invisible cancer in his brain was going to gobble up all of his memories and destroy his brain cells. It was the same disease that left old people shitting themselves in the corner watching Wheel of Fortune with stupid wonder. Dr. Robinson, that same guy that not 3 years before had proclaimed him to be one of his fittest patients, was now somberly telling him that his brain was giving up and quitting on him. But of course, he hadn't wanted to accept it. Wasn't that also the way it went? We all knew the deal, but none of us wanted to pay the piper when the bill came due. Keith had done all of the foolish things we all do. He'd assured Dr. Robinson that he'd mixed up the charts. It happens. Go double check kindly. But he hadn't. He'd called him a fool and demanded a second opinion, but deep down he'd known he was probably right. It just felt right. He'd noticed the little memory hiccups, and he'd hoped that they were just fleeting, just a normal part of aging. But they weren't. He'd sat on this wonderful news that his wife and their entire life together would soon be taken away from him in a merciless twist of fate for 2 days. He just couldn't think of how to broach the subject with her. But one day he'd just come home from the hardware store and there it had been taped to the door. And oh, the promises of that flyer, oh, the glorious promises. It had read like a miracle and immediately erased any needs to tell his wife of his dire prognosis. An old man sat on the cover of the flyer staring out a window. His back was to the flyer holder, legs crossed casually at the hip, watching a bird sail across the sky. Above his head, bold words screamed, "Losing your faculties? Is getting old getting to you?" Fresh off his prognosis, Keith had been intrigued. He unfolded the pamphlet. Has your body and mind begun to turn against you? You aren't alone. Here at the 301 Grand Clinic, our medical scientists have made outstanding breakthroughs in the field of aging. You don't have to get old. Dying is a thing of the past. Your mind doesn't have to betray you. It's your decision. It's your body. It's your mind. Take them back today. Come to the 301 Grand Clinic with this flyer and receive a free consultation. What did he have to lose? He could at least hear them out. And if it was one of the usual bullshit scams to squeeze money out of old people, then he would hot-foot it out of there. He was old, he was slowly losing his memories, but he was no fool. He'd been on enough calls with lying CEOs reviewing their quarterly earnings to not be suckered in by a good presentation alone. Slowly, the true strengthened its grip, lighting his brain, re-energizing his soul, pumping fresh blood into atrophied muscles that were awakened for the first time in weeks. Soon he'd be able to stand and get the fuck out of there. But not yet. Not quite yet. His brain still held that uneasy queasiness that was something like cruise ship seasickness, but wasn't. An ancient man bent over a cane hobbled toward him in a lurching motion. The cane slapping the floor, his feet sliding behind it, only to repeat the entire process again. Something else they don't tell you about getting older. You don't leave this world without the help of a cane. It was just how it went. The old man, he bit his lip with every step, but he was determined. This old man, he looked used, beaten. This weathered, rotten husk that used to be a vibrant man who no doubt did things, who had goals in life. He'd probably skipped and jumped in rain puddles when he was a kid, giggling at the splash, pants wet and meaningless. Now he shuffled, pitched forward on a cane that kept him ambulatory, dragging one foot behind the other like a mummy would in the movies. Keith wondered how old he was. Once over 60, it was impossible to tell how old people were. All those gray, wrinkled shells of humanity. He wasn't there yet. He wasn't as old, but he was on his way. Soon he would have a cane. His trick knee would see to that. He looked like he'd waited more than 90 days since his last treatment. His patchy white hair was plastered to his pink scalp with exertion. His vein-striped nose looked redder than it should be. His forehead dripped sweat down the heavy creases of his ancient cheeks. He slumped onto the crusty couch. A drug-addled grin licked his chapped, bleeding lips. Looking at this older, deader man, he couldn't help but feel a little bit better about himself. No matter how bad things got, there was always someone in a worse situation. Seeing geezers like that guy wheezing on the couch opposite him really made him solidify his decision. This was exactly what he didn't want to become, what he didn't want to be. And honestly, fuck donors like Miss Carlson. Damn her for making him feel guilty. She was getting what she deserved. She had no doubt wasted her life with years of drug use. Hell, she probably traded her body and any dignity for lines of cokes and tiny hits of heroines that she shot between her toes. Damn her for making him feel even momentarily guilty. That one's a tasty one for sure. The old man opposite him blurted stringy saliva dangling from the corners of his mostly toothless mouth. Pardon me? It was almost time to go. He could feel the lethargy leaving him, the slur leaving his voice entirely. I said that one's a tasty one. She was good. He licked his slobbery old man lips with a cracked tongue, what was left of his rotten teeth peeking out. He cocked his thumb toward Miss Adrian Carlson, her blank stare, her canted back and twisted neck, her gray skin. Slurping back saliva, he mumbled, I like 'em young like that. They taste better. It works better. His old cataract-clouded eyes were distant. The true hadn't worked its magic yet. He didn't as much look at Keith as he looked through Keith, as if he wasn't even there. Keith felt sick, watching the old man revel in his taste of the normally nameless, faceless donors made him ill all over again. It would have been bad enough if it had been random, one of the many donors silently being pumped free of their vitality in the warehouse around them. But no, this old fuck crooked his thumb directly at Adrian Carlson's bed. And here, after he'd just come to grips with her lot, here was this old fuck, this ancient man, making him feel guilty all over again. What right did this old fuck have to taste her? His time had come and should be gone, but he was getting greedy, and she was left to suffer for it. Her youth, her vitality, her being, all being drained away for the preservation of this old fuck's life. And for what? Just so he could continue just a little bit longer? Who was he and what made him so goddamn special? Why do you say that? How do you know where your true came from? There are literally dozens of donors in here. He dared not look at the rows and rows of hospital beds, the droning, clicking machinery, the liposuction in reverse machines, the plastic, grinning nurses. All of it was too much. He just couldn't look. Well, I asked the doc. He told me all of today, everyone is coming from little Miss Blondie over there. Something about she's starting to rot. Like things are going bad for her, so they need to finish her off to drain the rest of her, so to speak. And I'm telling you, man, she is a good one. He hoped, wished even, that the old slobbery fuck was wrong. But he knew he wasn't. Deep down, he knew it was her essence pulsing through him, the true that they had tapped from poor Miss Adrian Carlson. Suddenly, he didn't want it anymore. Even with its euphoric high, its brain-lighting power, its energy reviving verve. But of course, it was too late. He had already been fed her through a main line. The band-aid on the inside crook of his elbow was all the proof anyone needed. He suddenly wanted to gnaw on his wrist and rip open his own veins to free her from his body's greedy hold. Instead, he checked his watch. His watch told him that he could leave, that he'd been on the clinic's recovery couch for long enough, and it wasn't a moment too soon. He was well enough now to walk, and he'd be goddamn if he'd sit there another minute listening to the blabbering old fuck, the fuck that should be dead, the fuck that was cheating life, stealing from the young. He rose to his feet, and this time his legs didn't wobble. They didn't betray him. He couldn't look at Adrian. He just couldn't. Her idiot eyes would do him in. He would walk over and put a pillow to her face to let her go, to just end whatever suffering these extractions were surely causing. But he couldn't. He shuddered to think of what those vampiric nurses would do to him if he cut off one of their supply. He briefly imagined them strapping him onto the bed in her place. He couldn't. He just fucking couldn't. So he averted his eyes from Adrian and instead headed toward the front desk. He passed by the shuffling nurses, those stealers of life, those robbers of vitality, those rapers of innocence, those vampires. He passed those almost liposuction machines, those needles piercing young people's spines and skulls. He passed all of the blinking lights, the fading EKGs. Then he passed by the afflicted, the old fucks with their support hose, failing bladders, and decaying minds, those old fucks who'd found their fountain of youth and goddamn anyone who managed to get in their way. As he reached the door to thrust his way out into the world, back to his life where he could forget about poor Miss Adrian Carlson and her giant idiot eyes, a voice called out behind him.
Excuse me, sir?
With one hand on the door and one foot in the sunlight beyond, he turned.
We need to schedule your next appointment. Let's see. 90 days from today. That should put us somewhere around the 30th of September. Does that work with your schedule?
And as he stood in the doorway, one foot in the clinic, 1 foot on the street beyond, his brain almost tickling from the true and his heart breaking for poor Miss Carlson. He thought of his wife, his beautiful younger wife, that poor woman that had helped the elderly for so many years, that poor woman who had been closer than she'd ever known to having to help her own elderly husband. To feed him, to change his shitty diapers, this poor woman whose birthday he suddenly remembered was December 12th. Basking in the true, Adrian's true. He clearly remembered his wife exactly as she'd been. As she'd been on their wedding day, as she'd been on their honeymoon. He suddenly remembered every anniversary gift, including the diamond earrings that she'd been wearing at breakfast that morning, that 23rd anniversary present. The true had unlocked his mind. He remembered their cruise trip to Barbados, an argument they'd had one night 20 years ago over who should pick up the dog from doggy daycare on Friday. He remembered everything, things important and things meaningless just the same. He remembered everything about everything he'd ever known. His mind had been opened. It was alive again. But most importantly, he remembered everything about the wonderful woman with that gray swatch of pubic hair and how they'd met in the tiny bar on the south side and how he'd swept her off her feet. He remembered how her hair had smelled of peppermint while they were dancing, her young body pressed against his under a spinning globe of luminance. He remembered her young, kind eyes and how deeply had stared into him before that first magical kiss under the stars on that cold December night. He remembered all of this. He remembered everything about her, the woman that had loved him unconditionally, the woman whom he'd loved unconditionally.
Sir?
And as he stood there with the droning machines of scurrying vampires, the so-called afflicted, and of course society's wasted youth, the donors, he wondered, a life for a life? Could it ever be a fair trade?
Sir, will you be available the 30th of September?
The receptionist repeated, tapping her ballpoint pen somewhat impatiently on an appointment book. A fair trade. Could there ever be one when it came to love? Yes. He swallowed hard. I'll be here. He closed his eyes, the sun warm on his skin, and he stepped out into the world. And that concludes The Afflicted. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Dark Passages. Please join us next week as the story continues. As always, if you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe, share, and rate and review us on iTunes or wherever else you get your podcasts. Please follow us on dark.passages.podcast on Instagram for additional information and episode release schedules. Original stories are all written by Chris Stone and are available on Amazon as ebooks. I'm Savannah, thank you for listening, and we will see you next week.